Okay, I guess we can get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome or welcome back to the webinar series hosted by the Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai. I'm Selina Hong, Assistant Professor of Literature and the Center's Interim Director for this year. For those of you who follow our program closely, then you know that we've had a very eventful month of April, and today is the last of this month's webinars. Upcoming next Tuesday, which will be May, to give everyone a sneak peek, we will welcome our last speaker for the semester, Professor Josh Stenberg from the University of Sydney, who is the author of the book Minority Stages, Sino-Indonesian Performance in Public Display, published in 2019. Professor Stenberg will give us a talk on the circulation of Chinese drama and theater in Europe, the Americas, and in Southeast Asia. So for example, theater translation in France, and a performance of Beijing opera in Canada, and Chinese origin puppetry in Indonesia. So if you want to attend this webinar next Tuesday, you can RSVP through this QR code that you see on the screen, or you can do this from our website directly as well. So now I'm very delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Rebecca Enworth, who is a dear friend and in fact also a former colleague of ours. I was just chatting with Rebecca and I told her that I believe the first time Rebecca came to NYU Shanghai was in November 2016, also as a speaker for the Center for Global Asia. That's about 1 year after we formally launched the center. She then joined us formally at NYU Shanghai in 2017 for 2 years, and has left many wonderful legacies to us who are teaching here or doing administrative jobs here at NYU Shanghai. So I was telling Rebecca how wonderful it is that we are still following some of the exciting and wonderful legacies that she has left here. Now, thanks to virtual technology, I'm really excited that I'm able to welcome Rebecca back today to NYU Shanghai. So introduction. Professor Enworth is currently an assistant professor of translation, primarily between Chinese and German at the University of Applied Sciences Munich in the Sprachen and Domischer Institute. And she also teaches at Jilin International Studies University in Changchun. She received her PhD in sinology from Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, or LMU. Her research focuses on Sinophone literature, mainly in Southeast Asia, post-colonial studies, queer film studies, contemporary Chinese art and film, as well as creative teaching techniques. Her book on contemporary Sinophone literature in Thailand was published in 2018 with Harrisowitz in Germany, and a journal article on intertextuality in Sino-Thai literature has been recently published in Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, the journal. It is titled Playing with the Canon, the Uncanny Pleasure of Intertextuality in the Works of Sinophone Thai writers Sumagong and Feng Hing, the two authors with whom I believe she will also discuss today. And I should in fact also say that this is one of the richest discussions of Sinophone literature from Thailand from a narratological approach. I have read recently and I learned a lot from this work of hers. So Rebecca is currently also working on an article about the Shanghai Queer Film Festival and co-editing a book on contemporary German Chinese cultures in dialogue, which will be published in 2023 with Springer. Today, she will give us a talk on the relationship between storytelling, metafiction, and self-making from the perspective of Chinese-descended Sinophone Thai writers from Thailand. The title of today's talk is very interesting. The Thief Who Stole My Story, Self-Narration and Metafiction in Sinophone Literature from Thailand. So before I hand the floor over to Rebecca, a quick heads up to our audience. So during the first hour, we will listen to Rebecca's talk. Afterward, we will then open the floor for a Q&A conversation with the audience. For this, there are two ways in which you can ask questions. First, you can use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. And once I see your raised hand, I will call on you to unmute and speak directly with Rebecca. And I strongly encourage everyone to make use of this function for conversation. Alternatively, you can also type down your question in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. And you can do so either during the talk, whenever you think of a question, or after the talk. Okay, so I guess without further ado, I'm now very happy to turn the floor over to Professor Rebecca Enworth.
Thank you so much, Selena, for this warm and kind welcome and for introducing me. I'm very, very happy, even though I can't be in Shanghai physically, I'm very happy that I am with you. One of the advantages of the pandemic is indeed that we can, although we cannot be together in person, which is very, very sad because I would have loved to see you all. We can expand the audience, and I see a lot of familiar faces, and I can't see faces, but I can see names, a lot of familiar names, and I'm very, very happy to see them. And of course, also those of you I don't know, a very warm welcome also from my side. So thank you, Selena. Thanks also to the Center for Global Asia for inviting me again. As Selena has mentioned, I've been invited by NYU Shanghai in the past. And also a thank you to Haozhi and Mingming and all the other people who had to help me with the logistics of this talk. They were really, really helpful, and I really appreciate what they have done. So thanks to you too. Thank you. And thanks to all of you who took the time and who want to listen to the talk. I hope it's going to be interesting and exciting for you. Thanks for coming. And now I will start my presentation. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I just minimize me. I don't need to see me. So the title of my talk is The Thief Who Stole My Story, Self-Narration and Metafiction in Contemporary Sinophone Literature from Thailand. And I'm going to explain a little bit where the title, The Thief Who Stole My Story, comes from a little bit later on. But before I do so, let me start. Imagine you had a heritage box in which one would find everything that you inherited from your parents, your grandparents, your ancestors. What would be in it? What did you inherit from them that you consider part of your identity? When I asked Feng Hing and Sumagong, the two Sinophone Thai authors whose works I am going to discuss today, if their literature can be seen as a reflection of their identities, they answered with a definite yes. And further questioned about the relation of their literary works and their imagined heritage boxes, they mentioned that almost everything they write about is connected to their identity or identities, their Chinese or rather Teochew descent on the one hand and their Thai nativeness on the other. However, when looking closely at their literary works, one finds another recurring topic, that is writing or being a writer, which one cannot find in their heritage boxes. So how does that third identification, the identification of being a writer, fit into their own perception as Thai of Teochew descent, and how important is the content of an imagined heritage box for Sinophone literature in Thailand? So these are the two questions I had at the beginning. How does being a writer fit into their perception as Thai of Teochew descent, and how important is the content of their imaginary heritage box? Before starting, I want to give you, before starting and taking a closer look at their literature, I will quickly give you an overview of what I will be discussing today. So I mentioned the heritage box, and I'm going to introduce the two authors to you now in a second. I'm focusing, as I said, on Feng Hing and Sumagong. There are, of course, a lot of other Sinophone Thai authors. If you have questions about that, you can ask me, of course, in the Q&A. After introducing the author's bios, I will give you a brief overview of the development of Sinophone literature in Thailand from its beginnings until today. And then I will go over to the main part of my talk, which is in red here, discussing the role of self-narration and metafiction in Sumagong's and Feng Hing's works. I will close by giving a short outlook on the future of Sinophone literature in Thailand and have a peek at the content of a heritage book Sumagong and Feng Hing would like to hand down to the next generation of Sinophone Thai writers. So the first part, as you can see, is more descriptive. I will explain a little bit the whole situation of Thai Sinophone literature. Please bear with me, while the second part will be more analytical and therefore hopefully more engaging also, since I will show some examples of their works, and I'm happy also if you have some thoughts, comments on those works, please let me know. In his book on the development and history of Sinophone Thai literature, 给泰华文学把脉, Feng Hing states that the new generation of Sinophone Thai literature lacks local flavor, which may ultimately lead to an end of Sinophone literature in Thailand. However, I am arguing that the literary works of the new generation not only lacks local flavor, but also self-reflection. While Sumagong and Feng Hing both write not only about their experiences as Thai individuals with Chinese heritage or descent, they also write themselves into existence by creating metafictional stories and poems, which question and interrogate the appearance of Sinophone literature from Thailand in all its different facets. The so-called new generation of writers, however, self-evidently appears without neither questioning its existence nor doubting it, doubting that they are indeed representatives of Sinophone literature in Thailand. With that lack of self-perception, they assert the presumed Han Chinese hegemony and undermine the multifacetedness of Sinophone literature. This, of course, will ultimately lead to the subsumption of Thai Sinophone literature under the overarching term of Chinese language literature, losing its Thainess altogether. Only through the engagement with what it means to be a writer, what writing means, what literature is or can be in the intersection of their double identity as Thai on the one hand and Techo or Chinese on the other, Sumagong and Feng Hing become Sinophone Thai writers. However critical writers like Feng Hing and Sumagong see the emergence of that new generation, they are also thankful, or rather hopeful, that Sinophone literature in Thailand might live on in some way, even though it's not the way they imagine. Since both authors are already over 80, they wish for young Sinophone authors to continue their legacy and make Sinophone literature in Thailand bloom again. But how do their lives differ from that of the new generation? Let's have a look at their bios. Sumagong was born in 1933 in Bangkok as Kriang Chao Drong Sang. His ancestors, so he has a Thai name and he just later assumes the Chinese name he has now. And that, of course, is a pen name as well. So he goes on with multiple names, but Sumagong is the one he uses most frequently. His ancestors came from Shantou in Guangdong province. Since all men in his family had been merchants for several generations, the family not only still had strong ties to China, but they also expected their son to become a merchant in Thailand. When Sumagong was 6 years old, he was sent to relatives in Shantou and attended school there. He returned to Thailand when he was 20 years old, so he stayed there for quite a while, only to follow his family's wishes and entering the family business. However, during his time in China, he developed an interest for literature and began writing himself in the mid-1960s. He joined the literary cycle of Sinophone writers in the 1970s, but soon afterwards took a 10-year break from writing in order to concentrate on the family business. And here I quote, he says, "In Thailand, one cannot sustain a living by writing Sinophone literature. All Sinophone writers have to write in their free time." That's a quote by Sumagong. Yet in the mid-80s, he takes up writing again, joins the Society of Sinophone Writers, Taihua Zuojia Jiehui, in 1987, shortly after it was established, and is elected their president shortly after that in 1990. And as you can see from the slide, he was its president for 20 years, which is quite a long time. Among his peers, he is considered one of the most prolific and influential Sinophone writers in Thailand, and he still writes up until today. While Sumagong learned Mandarin in school in China, Feng Hing was born in 1938, also in Bangkok. He also has a Thai name, and he never, contrary to Sumagong, he never had the opportunity to go to China as a child. So he took on the Chinese name, which is also a pen name, only very late. Although he had attended a Thai school in Bangkok, and although his parents never spoke Chinese at home, he showed a great interest in learning it already as a young boy. And he started learning it together with his big brother, but his big brother, he wasn't really interested, so he soon didn't follow him. And Feng Hing went on learning Mandarin on his own, and made it possible for him to enroll at the University for Overseas Chinese in Shantou in 1956. In 1962, he passed the entrance exam at Xiamen University, and started studying Chinese. During this time, he took part in several writing contests already and won a couple of prizes. However, due to the Cultural Revolution, he finished his studies and started working only to be sent to the countryside in 1969. It is only in 1982 that he returned to Bangkok, where he started working as a merchant, like Sumagong. And like Sumagong as well, he took a long break from writing in between. When he resumed writing again in the early 1990s, his works instantly got a lot of positive feedback by his peers, which encouraged him to become an active member in the Society of Sinophone Writers in Thailand. Apart from being a member in that society, he also served as president for the World Association of Sinophone Writers, and he is the co-founder of the poetry group Little Poetry Mill, which was established in 2006. The Little Poetry Mill is a small group of Sinophone poets with about 10 core members. Amongst them, Yangling, the daughter of Lao Yang. Lao Yang is one of the first Sinophone poets in Thailand. And his daughter followed his footsteps. So she actually inherited that from her father. And besides Yangling, we also have Lin Huanzhang from Taiwan. And although Lin Huanzhang is not Thai, due to his strong connections or ties to Thailand, he's one of the founding members of the Little Poetry Mill, which testifies to the inclusiveness and the openness of the Sinophone Thai writers community. So it is really about writing, not about the national identity per se. Even though Feng Hing has joined the group of Sinophone writers relatively late, he's generally regarded as one of the most prestigious Sinophone writers in Thailand. And I have to say, he's also one of the most active ones still, even though he is not the youngest anymore. He initiates meetings and regular meetings with his fellow writers and also conferences. And yeah, he's doing really a lot to also try to make advertisement for the community of Sinophone writers in Thailand. Both authors, Sumagong and Feng Hing, grew up with a sense of being Chinese. I mean, Feng Hing a little bit later, of course, than Sumagong, because he wasn't sent to school in China and because his parents weren't that involved in or interested in teaching him. At least not the language. They identify or learn to identify as Chinese in different ways. While Sumagong's parents fostered his feeling of Chineseness by sending him to China at a very young age, Feng Hing developed a curiosity for the language of his ancestors, so to say, without any parental guidance. Both spent a significant amount of their lives in China, but never thought of China as their home country. So that's an important point. It's not that they ever thought China is something they need to go back to. They have settled in Thailand. Now, let me jump over to the development of Sinophone literature in Thailand. The beginning of Sinophone literature in Thailand can be traced back to the beginning of the 20th century, as you can see here from the timeline, around the year 1910. And you can also see it's very small, that's why I'm pointing it out. We have 3 peaks and 2 lows. I'm focusing more on the peaks, and I'm just commenting at the end a little bit on the lows because the peaks are more interesting, at least for this talk for us. However, in the very beginning, Sinophone literature in Thailand was very Chinese, as Sumagong put it, and had not yet developed distinctive features, so around 1910. It is only in the 1920s that Chinese language newspapers in Thailand, such as the Hanjing Daily, Hanjing Rabao, or the Zhonghua Minbao, started publishing literary supplements, so-called Weni Fukan, in which serialized novels or short stories written by Chinese immigrants in Thailand were printed. In the following years, Sinophone literature in Thailand went through different stages. You can see the stages here, 3 peaks and 2 lows. Inspired by the May 4th movement at the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, so a little bit later after the May 4th movement, there is a first peak in Sinophone literature in Thailand. So genres such as new poetry flourished. Introduced by Hu Shi in his essay on new poetry, this literary genre was introduced in China in October 1919 during the New Cultural Movement, and it pled for free verse in vernacular language by Hua rather than classical Chinese Wenyan. This new literary genre also gained popularity among the Sinophone writers in Thailand, and not only in Thailand, but also in other Southeast Asian countries. Most of the poems mirror this generation's homesickness and longing to return to China. So here we can still see, because they just arrived in Thailand, that they still feel that China is their home. And that's why they want to return to China. Sinophone literature reached another peak in the early 1950s, which lasted until the mid-1960s. Especially novels and translations were en vogue in the community of Sinophone writers. By that time, many of the writers have either been born in Thailand or gained Thai citizenship, so that already changes something. Yet, after the establishment of the PRC in 1949, a second wave of Chinese immigrants came to Thailand called the New Chinese or Xintang. Amongst them, a few aspiring writers who fused with the already existing group of Sinophone Thai writers. And that changes the whole situation again. In their works, they mainly reflect on their lives as Chinese in Thailand, the difficulties they face, but also traditional Chinese family values and the education of their children. In addition to these works written in Sinitic script, Chinese literature from China was also translated into Thai by some of the Sinophone authors. While locally produced Sinophone literature tried to make its way to China, traditional Chinese literature found its way to a Thai-speaking audience. Sinophone literature in Thailand reached its final peak in the 1980s, after the Thai government had lifted its restrictions on Chinese schools and Chinese language education. And here I want to mention the 2 lows. The 2 lows that you can see here, even though they are very small, they are very important or influential for the development of Thai Sinophone literature because of the political situation. At both times, Chinese schools and newspapers were forbidden or shut down even. So if there was Chinese literature, it had to go underground and had to be written in secrecy. And of course, nothing was published in Thailand. It couldn't be published in Thailand during those times. but it had to be published in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and therefore also everything, the group got smaller, of course, and it only got bigger again with then the arrival first of the new immigrants, and then also after the restrictions were lifted in the 1980s. And yet another wave of Chinese immigrants arrived also in the late 1980s in Thailand, and some Sinophone writers who had turned to business took up writing again, like Sumagong and Feng Hing. In 1986, the Society of Sinophone Writers in Thailand had been established, which is also a big turning point, of course. So this period, this last period, the last peak, is called the Golden Autumn of Sinophone writing in Thailand by Feng Hing, since many works were published and the society flourished. Writers such as Sumagong and Feng Hing, who describe themselves as having reached the ground and taken roots, Wadi Shongan, I'm gonna discuss that expression a little bit later again, combine their Chinese with their Thai cultural heritage and express their feeling of belonging to Chaoshan, which is the area around Chaozhou and Shantou in Guangdong province, so Teochew speaking community, as well as to Thailand in their literary works. So coming back to the heritage box and the topics of their literature. When looking at the flash fiction and poems they have written in the last 20 years, and that's basically what I did, 25 years, one can broadly categorize them into 4 main groups. The first one is China, as you can see here. Stories and poems about China make up about 43% of their works. The themes range between stories and poems about food, customs, rituals, intertextuality, so reference and rewritings of Chinese classics, for example, but also the Nanjing Massacre, Chinese immigration to Thailand, and language. For instance, the switch from traditional characters to simplified Chinese in the Chinese language press in Thailand, or Chinese language learning in Thailand. Okay. The second group, which makes up about 23% of the stories and poems, is Thailand. You can see it here on the right side. Popular themes include Chinese business in Thailand or Chinese businessmen in Thailand, life in Bangkok, similarities and differences between Teochew and Thai, so the languages, and so on. So there are also very funny stories, I have to say. The third group is Buddhism. It's about 12%, and these are texts mainly about rituals and practices, as well as the life of monks. And the fourth group, which makes up for about 21%, so almost as much as Thailand, is what I called identity, broadly identity, because it is not only about their identity as writers, of being a writer, of creating fiction, but it is also to some extent about their cultural identities as Teochew and Thai. However, the majority of these texts, of these stories, falls into the category of written identity. So I would say about 85 to 90% are about writing, which is really a lot. Naturally, there are also lots of overlaps and intersections between these 4 categories, so they are not fixed and given. For instance, we can find languages in both the China and the Thailand category, and also subcategories such as Chinese business in Thailand theoretically has to be put in, can be put in both categories, either to China or to Thailand, because it refers to both, as well as some stories about Buddhist rituals, which are clearly set in Thailand and focus on Thailand, would also fall into both categories. So it's sometimes really hard to separate them, and I had to make a decision. And there are also stories and poems which fall in none of these categories, but they are it's like 1% of all the stories that I have read, and I have read and also translated into German. Most of the works, almost all of their works, they have published in the last 20 years. And it's only 1% that is about something completely different that cannot be put into either of these categories. As you can see from this graph, also written identity is a big part of their works, yet the interest in and passion for writing is not something they have inherited by their parents, as they both state. Writing, although nowadays a big part of their identities, is therefore not something one can find in their heritage boxes, but something they discovered while staying in China or shortly after returning from China. So if writing is not something which is in their genes, so to say, not something they grew up with or which was an essential part of their upbringing, how does writing play such an important role in the later part of their lives? And in which ways does this influence the overall development of Sinophone literature in Thailand? Like many other writers, Sumagong and Feng Hing were not born as writers. I mean, who is maybe some people, like very famous people, but still some people, they just focus on writing. That's not what Sumagong and Feng Hing did. Because before they started writing, they pursued a profession with which they could earn money, which secured them a livelihood. And writing never secured them a livelihood. That's what they said. And so that also differentiates them, of course, from other famous writers, or from famous writers in general, maybe. Unlike the writers of the new generation, so the young writers that we have nowadays in Thailand, they do not see writing as a hobby, which one can seriously pursue while working. So all the younger generation, while they are working, they are also writing literature. That's nothing Sumagong and Feng Hing ever did. Even though Sumagong's and Feng Hing's interest for literature might have developed earlier, they, so to say, gave up writing in favor of making a living, only to take it up again in the 1980s or 1990s, respectively, in order to fully concentrate on writing, to publish, and to discuss their works with peers. This implies not only that writing is more than a pastime, but also that only then they were able to critically question their identity as Sinophone writers, or begin to question that. This leads us what now Neumann and Nünning have called narrative self-making. And I quote, "Through narrativization, heterogeneous and potentially ever-fluctuating experiences are transformed into a more or less coherent form, suggesting closure of one's life and relative stability of one's diachronic identity," unquote. While the new generation of writers such as Fan Jun or Lan Yan has been described as floating like water lotuses, 水莲漂浮, by Feng Hing, attesting to the uncertainty regarding their identity as Sinophone Thai writers, Feng Hing's generation has settled or reached the ground and taken roots, I've mentioned that before, in Thailand, Luadi Shungan, in their identity as Sinophone Thai writers. I quote, "Stories establish the identity of the storyteller by creating chains of events and providing causal explanations for changes. In this vein, self-narrative is the very site where we give meaning to our autobiographical experiences and construct our identities by interweaving past and present experiences with the threads of a life history," unquote. Therefore, as I have argued elsewhere, like intertextuality, metafiction is employed to deconstruct their own subjectivities as Sinophone writers in Thailand. And to illustrate that point, I finally want to turn to the examples. First, we need an appointment with the muse. Late at night, I'm sitting alone in my boat to have an appointment with the muse. The boat rocks, aroused, shaking off the star-studded sky. The image of an implicit lyrical I sitting alone in a boat can also be found in classical Chinese nature poetry, such as that of Du Fu or Meng Haoran. They were often in those classical poems. They often have the solitary boat, the duzhou, floating on the river, drawing attention to the landscape around it before focusing on the emotions and feelings of the poet. The surrounding in Feng Hing's poem, however, seems secondary, since the lyrical I, the poet himself, is the pivot, merging with the boat in the second stanza. The poet needs a muse, which is also mirrored in other poems, such as The Muse and I. The parallel lines in the first two stanzas, as well as the parallel construction with lai and chu in the last stanza, draw attention to the very heart of poetry, which is its form. The mentioning of the sky and the sea, so again, nature, reminds the reader of nature poetry, but also seems to tell that nature is a source for inspiration and creativity. Nature is the muse. And again, the poet finds inspiration in solitude here. He is alone in nature and waiting for the muse, but the muse is the nature, so he's all alone. But as suggested in other poems like this one, the poet can also find inspiration in the company of fellow poets. For instance, in this poem, The Grindstone Spins Rapidly. Here, Feng Hing describes how the establishment of the poetry group, the Little Poetry Mill, in 2006, 小时磨坊, advances Sinophone Thai poetry. While Feng Hing concentrates more on how literature is created in his poems, Sumagong pays special attention to its very form. The poem Little Poem, 小时, for instance, comments on the origin of this literary form, namely it suddenly jumped out, 跳出来, of the family of poems 从时的家族. The implicit lyrical eye defines this secession as a betrayal of the family in the second stanza, but he also calls it the only way forward. Sumagong not only comments on the existence of little poems by writing a little poem, he also writes little poems about other literary genres and forms such as flash fiction. A firefly's flash is more dazzling than a torch. With this poem, Sumagong not only comments on the power of flash fiction, he also attests to the power of little poems, since like flash fiction, they too are precise and short, and therefore brilliant. They dazzle the reader with their very form. Sumagong is generally seen as a pioneer among his peers because of his avant-garde style and his commitment to introduce new forms, such as flash fiction, to the community of Sinophone writers. In 2012, he writes to the then president of the Society of Sinophone Writers in Thailand, and she's still the president now. Her name is Meng Li. Meng Li, there is a new genre. It's called flash fiction. It is very en vogue in China at the moment. I wrote some stories to test it out. They will soon be published in the journal Sinophone Literature in Thailand. What do you think about it? Only a few years later, not only almost every Sinophone writer in Thailand has written flash fiction or even published an edition of flash fiction, but also not just in Thailand, but also in Southeast Asia. So it spread also in whole Southeast Asia. There is a lot of flash fiction also in other countries appearing now and before. And in 2017, Feng Hing edited a volume of flash fiction by Sinophone writers from Southeast Asia and China, which is called 新世纪东南亚文化善小说选集, published by Zhejiang Gongshan University Press. And he has published other volumes, for example, about little poems, also with the same publishing house. And as you can see from the title, it's the whole Southeast Asia. It's Sinophone literature in Southeast Asia. So this is very interesting, I think. The continued use of metafiction shows that Sumagong as well as Feng Hing are very much inspired by Chinese avant-garde fiction. Therefore, their use of metafiction not only demonstrates self-consciousness in narrative creation, as Zhao has put it, but also highlights their admiration for Chinese fiction. By writing poems about the art of writing poems, the authors lay bare or deconstruct the intellectual work that goes into creating fiction. The paradox being here, of course, that it is not fiction, it's not so much fiction that they create, but it is a recreation of the reality they live in to some extent. Metafiction is used as a way to better understand writing and to self-reflect on their identity as writers. With that understanding in mind, I want to turn to the title of my talk, The Thief Who Stole My Story. And if you saw the picture, which is, by the way, thank you so much, whoever did the poster. It's really nice. I really like it. And if you look at it, you will see in the background a person that is actually Feng Hing. I don't want to imply that he's a thief. It just looked nice because you can only see him from the back and while he's leaving the scene. So that's why I took that picture. The title of my talk, The Thief Who Stole My Story, which refers to two types of stories. The first type are stories about plagiarism. You can see it on the right. I will discuss it in a minute. And then the other type is one particular piece of flash fiction entitled Pilfering Toe by Sumagong. I believe some of you have read the story, but for those of you who haven't, I'll give you a brief summary. In the first passage, the nameless protagonist is introduced as a writer of flash fiction who has been struggling with writing a story lately. While he's sitting at his desk late at night, agonizing over the story. Sorry, that was too early. He falls asleep. When suddenly someone whom he identifies as a thief appears in his study, he does not call the police, but decides to quietly observe the intruder while he's roaming around looking for things he can steal. Finally, the petty thief finds the manuscript he was working on the desk, which the thief then decides to take. Using direct speech, the heterodiegetic narrator, to use Gérard Genet's terminology, says, "This thief is really a connoisseur and he steals the most valuable things," or thing in that case. Since he does not want to lose his manuscript, in an effort to catch the intruder, the protagonist rushes towards him. In that moment, the protagonist jumps awake, seeing the manuscript still lying on the desk. And I quote, that's the last sentence, "There is still only one word written on the piece of paper, pilfering." With this story, Sumagong illustrates what Patricia Raw has called the fundamental and sustained opposition of metafiction, which is, and I quote, "the construction of a fictional illusion and the laying bare of that illusion by showing the reader how the story was written." It does not matter whether this is based on real events or even own experience, because its sole purpose is to emphasize and comment on the constructedness of fiction. Sorry. While in this case, the thief actually didn't steal the story, he didn't get away with it. In Feng Hing's The 101st example, Die by Ling Ilie, we learn that there can even be multiple thieves involved in the robbery or plagiarism, which is a kind of robbery of words, robbery of words. In the story, the editorial office of a newspaper receives a short story entitled The Lowest Rung, which an up-and-coming author wishes to publish. While the new copy editor, Mr. Xu, enthusiastically praises the story as a unique piece of literature, the old copy editor, Mr. Chen, is rather skeptical. The story seems all too familiar to him, so that he begins searching in his documents for the original. After a couple of days, he unsuccessfully gives up, only to be mocked by his new and young colleague, Mr. Xu. It is only half a month later that said Mr. Xu receives a letter in which a reader explains that the story, The Lowest Rung, which after all was printed by the newspaper, is indeed a copy of a story with a similar title published in a newspaper in Hong Kong in 1995. Attached to the letter is a photocopy of the original. While Mr. Xu plans to publish now both stories together side by side in the next edition to point out the plagiarism, Mr. Chen wants to send the letter together with the original manuscript to the author of the alleged plagiarism, to the plagiarist himself. A few days later, Mr. Chen receives an answer by the alleged thief saying that he did not copy the story from the Hong Kong newspaper, but from a newspaper published in China in 1991. Enclosed to the letter is a copy of the 1991 original with the same title. When Mr. Xu compares the two stories, he discovers that only the name of the river Yangtze in China, was changed to the Chao Phraya in Thailand, therefore changing the setting of the story from China to Thailand. Mr. Xu gets angry and screams, "Damn it! Are all texts in the world just copies?" When he asks Mr. Chen for advice, the old man only coughs and walks away. The story ends with Mr. Chen sitting at home and adding the 101st example to his list of copied or stolen stories. Although never explicitly mentioned, the setting of Feng Hing's story is probably Thailand, since the author of the plagiarized story changed the setting of the lower rung from China to Thailand, which means that the fictitious author is also probably a Sinophone Thai writer. We find a story with a similar content also in Sumagong's oeuvre. In the flash fiction, I also have this book, 这本书我也有. The third person narrator finds one day an essay by a close friend in an edition of the journal Literature and Art, which looks very familiar to him. When he finds the original in another book, he is very surprised to have identified his writer friend as plagiarist and ponders over what to do about it. If he informs the editor of Literature and Art about the case, his friend's reputation would be ruined. In the end, he decides to send an anonymous letter with a copy of the original to his friend. Not only deal both stories, Feng Hing's The 101st Example and Sumagong's I Also Have This Book, with plagiarism, but their protagonists also take similar actions. Instead of telling on the plagiarist, they decide to confront him, which parallels the behavior of the protagonist in the story Pilfering, who follows the thief rather than calling the police. By focusing on the almost stolen goods in their stories, which is the text, Sumagong and Feng Hing are emphasizing the text within the text structure, the meta level. And by placing their stories so close to their own lives, they break through the frame that separates fiction from the real world. Even though the stories are written in the third person, the reader is left asking whether the events are based on real experiences. After all, the stories draw attention to a very real threat for writers in general, which is that of being copied and robbed of their intellectual property. Plagiarism is, however, not their only topic. Similar to Pilfering in mini short story 小小说, Sumagong uses explicit metafiction to let the I narrator, this time we have an I narrator, tell the reader how he wrote the story. However, with the explicit mentioning of Bangkok as the setting at the beginning of the story, he situates it closer to home. Therefore, it self-reflectively draws attention to the practice of fiction writing within the community of Sinophone writers in Thailand. As the I narrator of the story browses through the feuilleton of a newspaper, that's now a summary of the content, he finds a mini short story, which he really likes since it shows a section of contemporary Thai society, as he puts it. Impressed by the story, he decides to write a story himself, even though he has never done so before. He asks his old friend Lin Zhiwen for advice, since he has done some research on fiction writing in the past. So he's a very experienced writer himself as well. Lin Zhiwen patiently explains him the difference between a short story and a novella by comparing it with Chinese classics such as the Liao Zhai Zhi Yi. He also tells him how to write a short story and emphasizes that one needs to put a lot of time and effort into writing, even though it's just a very short story. The construction of the story is very important, and even more so is innovation. So that's why it's so difficult to write a short story or a short story. After his guest had asked him how much money one could earn with the publication of such a story in Thailand, Lin Zhiwen assumes that his guest is only interested in earning money by writing literature, and he throws him out of the house. The story ends with the narrator reflecting on what Lin Zhiwen has told him and what he has done, throwing him out of the house, and deciding to write a story about him, about his writer friend. Again, Sumagong carefully interviews China with Thailand in this story by referencing Chinese classics and implying that the characters either are Chinese or understand Chinese, and by letting Lin Zhiwen explain how much, or rather how little, money, Thai baht, one could earn for writing a story. As readers, we quickly realize that this is a metafictional text. Readers are not left with the illusion of reading a fictitious story, since Lin Zhiwen explains them how to write it. The text, and I quote, self-consciously draws attention to its status as an artifact. In providing a critique of their own methods of construction, such writings not only examine the fundamental structures of narrative fiction, they also explore the possible fictionality of the world outside the literary fictional text, unquote. This critique of their own methods of construction is emphasized in the story through the narrator's suggested motivation for writing the story. While knowing that money is neither Sumagong's nor Feng Hing's motive for writing, Sumagong is indirectly critiquing young and unexperienced writers who don't really know what to write about and who probably just write because they want to earn money. This brings us back to Feng Hing's bleak outlook on the future of Sinophone literature in Thailand. The literature of the new generation rather includes emotions and personal feelings. They discuss their new living conditions and ponder over their own experiences as immigrants in Thailand. While Sumagong's and Feng Hing's generation uses metafiction to deconstruct their own identities as Thai Sinophone writers, the new generation simply thinks they are writers instead of becoming writers. Therefore, they don't write fiction about fiction. They are also not obsessed with self-scrutiny, as Scholz has called metafiction, but they live in the moment. They write in the moment and therefore reflect only on that very moment. This certainly has something to do with the fact that this generation of writers, so the new generation, belongs to a different wave of migrants. Of migration. As John Fernquest from the Bangkok Post has stated, these migrants are different from previous generations, as many of them only transit through Thailand. They probably neither go back to China nor stay in Thailand. They are most of them are looking for work and for business opportunities, so they are not settling. They will, therefore, they have a different feeling to both Chineseness and Thainess. They do not feel attached to a particular place and are more flexible, or floating, as Feng Hing has put it. And remember, the floating like water lotuses. However, in order for Sinophone literature in Thailand to survive, writers must interact with the local culture and reflect on their writing. To conclude, looking back on the development of Sinophone literature in Thailand, we realized that it started with writers who were very much inspired by the literary trends in China, and that this literature was therefore, as Sumagong has said, very Chinese at the very beginning. However, thanks to the financial support of overseas Chinese, many Sinophone newspapers, or Chinese language newspapers at that time, were founded in Thailand and ultimately began to publish Chinese language literature. Although viewed as part of Chinese literature, this can be seen as the very root of Sinophone literature in Thailand. However, it is only after several ups and downs, as we have seen, that Sinophone literature arrived where it is today, with writers who have settled in Thailand but incorporate their Sinophone cultural heritage in their writing, and to create self-conscious literature in order to explore the relationship between fiction and reality, between art and entertainment. Yet, with the arrival of new immigrants from China since the late 1980s, a new generation of writers has evolved. with their literature rather reflecting on their individual lives and without incorporating Thailand into their writings, it seems that Thai Sinophone literature is rather regressing instead of progressing. If the authors would reflect on their literature and deconstruct it like Feng Hing and Sumagong's generation, they might be able to realize that. However, the absence of metafiction results in a lack of self-consciousness in their writing and of self-criticism on fiction. This is a very negative note to end on. That's why I'm gonna have a look at another poem by Feng Hing, which is not so much connected to metafiction, but about his more connected to his heritage box. And I also want to say then something about what they would like to put in their heritage boxes if they could pass it over on to the next generation. So the poem is entitled Tea. A green cart passes through the world, enters innumerable households. Out of the Zisha teapot flows the hometown's landscape, the ancestors' tea ceremony. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss or analyze this poem, and I leave it to your own interpretation what to make of this poem. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have during the Q&A. But I just want to say this, if the authors would have the possibility to hand over, to pass on a heritage box to the next generation of writers, then they definitely would put in metafiction or writing as something that one has to reflect upon, that one has to think about, because it is an integral part of their identity, and they believe that it also needs to be an integral part of every writer. So I think this would be something one would find in, besides other things like, for example, Chinese identity, but also Thai identity, something that we would find in their heritage boxes. With that, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you. Sorry.
Just found that I was muted. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for this scintillating talk. I really enjoyed listening. How do I put it? Listening to this audiovisual version of your analysis. I've written. I've read the written version of it, okay, but in a different format, right? And now listening to your conversation and very detailed analysis of the use of metafiction in the context of Sinophone Thai literature, that is really, really revealing, I think, in many ways, especially in terms of how writing, or let's say the practice of writing, says something very important about identity construction, right? As you suggested, here and there throughout the talk, right? That it is through the activity of writing that this notion of identity comes to be identity, or comes to be questioned and interrogated. So I really like this part among many other threads of information. I really like how you highlight the fact that writing is the gateway for them to begin thinking about the meaning and the problematic of identity as such, right? So there are many other takeaways for me, and I'm also particularly interested in perhaps hearing a little bit more about the tension that you have suggested between different generations of writers, especially between the writers of Feng Hing and Sumagong, who highlighted their sort of status, or their wish to 落地生根, as you mentioned, versus the new generation whose characteristic or features, and I feel it's also quite interesting. I mean, from the perspective of Sumagong and Feng Hing, who sort of think of themselves or as 水莲漂浮. So one thing that this notion of 水莲漂浮 reminds me of is this sort of a schematic layout, of different stages of migration, that Wang Gongwu has mentioned. And I mentioned this because there are, some people, among our audience who studied this stages by Wang Gongwu in our Chinese migrant and diasporic networks class. So it's interesting to see, how perhaps the most recent kind of generation, instead of seeing themselves more localized, in fact, perceive themselves as floating. And so I'm wondering, perhaps you could help us start the conversation from this. What do you think this tells us, perhaps, about the larger changes in the social, historical, or even society-wide kind of circumstances, right? That impacted specifically the Sinophone or Sino-Thai communities in Thailand, broadly speaking. What do you think of this tells us about perhaps the dynamic, the evolving dynamic and the changing relations between Thailand, and China, and perhaps not between China and the broader Southeast Asian societies in general? Do you think it says something, about that social historical aspect? Perhaps we could start from here, and I could then and the people in our audience, you could also start either writing down your questions or thinking about your questions. You can hit the raise hand function, and perhaps with this initial comment from Rebecca, okay, we can start taking some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Selina. I really like your question and the connection also to Wang Gongwu. That's very important, of course. I think in every country, in every community, and we can see these different stages of migration. The interesting point for me is especially because it is in this case, in the case of the Sinophone Thai literature, it is reflected in the literature, or you can see it even in the literature. So I'm not sure if they would perceive themselves as floating, because I think some of them might even think that they stay in Thailand. They might even stay in Thailand. So I don't know yet, because they are now in Thailand. They're right in Thailand, but they are certainly not as settled as previous generations, and they are frequently traveling back to China, and not just saying that China is their homeland, but they are also writing about it. So they write about their homesickness, or at least their experiences as Chinese individuals in Thailand. So they are not connected as much to Thailand as Feng Hing and Sumagong are. And I think the overall development, it's partly because, of course, the whole world is changing. It's more globalized. It's easier to travel. It's easier to also to go somewhere else, to live somewhere else. I mean, just look at us. We live there for 2 years and then go on and live somewhere else for a year. So it's not as static as it maybe used to be, because before, for the generation of Sumagong and Feng Hing, I mean, they are over 80, almost 90 at the moment. For them, it was not possible to just decide and say, okay, now I'm going to live in, I don't know, Europe, or I'm going to live in the US. And for the new generation, the younger generation, our generation, or my generation, or the generation before me, for them, it is a lot easier to just decide, in a way, to look, for example, for work in another country, because they see an opportunity there. And that's also something that has changed, I think. So, of course, Thailand always was a country that was seen as advantageous for business, for doing business. That's why a lot of Chinese came also that early to Thailand, and it's still that way. They feel, because there is a big Chinese community, or a community of Chinese descent, and also because of the strong ties between Thailand and China, and the open atmosphere. That's also another thing. It's a very welcoming and open atmosphere in Thailand. compared to other Southeast Asian countries where we have a lot more restrictions. In Thailand, it was, except for these two low points that I mentioned, Chinese never really experienced any oppression or anything that would feel them unwelcome in Thailand. And that's, I think, a very, very important point also for the new generation. I call them the new generation. Yeah, so that's my answer to your question. I hope that answers it. If not, please let me know.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I see that there are already a couple of questions coming in. Perhaps we could start with this question from Tristan, who am curious about this notion that you brought up, metafiction. I wonder, if Tristan wants to ask the question yourself. If so, perhaps we could unmute Tristan and see if he would like to ask the question, because I think this is really interesting, and so he deserves a conversation.
Hello. First, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I did want to ask if, first, I know you gave a timeline earlier just about the development of Thai Sinophone literature, but I also want to know how metafiction fits into that timeline, and I guess where the motivation to write metafiction comes from, or where it originates. And I also want to know if metafiction is always necessarily written, I guess, intentionally. Because, well, some of the examples, like at the beginning, one of the, I forget the exact title, but I think it was the first one with the muse. It doesn't seem entirely, or it seems very possible that it wasn't entirely intentional to write that self-narrative. I mean, intentionally. So I was wondering how that kind of fits into the whole genre. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question or questions. They are all very, very good and interesting, I think. So let me start with the timeline or the motivation for metafiction. You asked where that comes from. It partly arrived, I briefly mentioned that in the talk, but probably it was not, didn't make it specific enough. So it is actually coming from China. We have a trend in China, in an avant-garde trend. Some writers are using metafiction, and of course, Sumagong and Feng Hing always have a look at what's going on in China, what is the literary scene doing there, and I think they get a lot of inspiration from that as well. So metafiction actually just comes in with their generation, with Sumagong and Feng Hing. Before, we don't have any kind that one would call metafiction, but I have to say also, and that goes also to your to the other question, whether it's written intentionally or not. In one scholar argued, Zhao, who wrote an article about metafiction in contemporary Chinese literature, that one can find metafiction almost in every literary text, which is true to some extent, because you can sometimes find little traces of metafiction and in other texts as well, which are definitely not intentionally written as metafictional text, and which one might not even categorize as metafiction, but which could fall or indicate an awareness of what they are writing, or that it includes a discussion of the work to some extent as well. That's mainly in novels, of course. There can also be in novels, we also have sometimes just a paragraph. It's not the whole novel. But since I don't have Sinophone Thai authors are not so much invested in writing novels, I don't have a comparison here. So I don't know if they would also use metafiction to some extent in their novels as well. And then for your question, of the example with the muse, I agree. And again, that's something I think there are different, how should I say it, different stages maybe, or different levels of metafiction, if you want to do it, if you want to say so, even though levels is maybe not the correct word. But there are different kinds, let's say different kinds of metafiction. Some are more obvious in that way, like for example, when we have a story that discusses the way how the story is written, for example, like the thief story, the pilfering story. And then we have more indirect metafiction or metafictional texts, which are that of the muse, for example. Because here in that way, the muse is connected to getting an inspiration to write something. That's why it can be called metafictional, even though it's maybe not as explicit as other examples, like the pilfering example or the plagiarism examples. Does that make sense? And I'm not sure if I answered all your questions. I have the timeline, the motivation, or I didn't answer the question about the motivation. Well, I think it's pretty much inspired by China, by the literary trends in China, but they decide, of course, to adapt that literary trend and to try it out, so to say, in the Thai Sinophone community as well. And that is because that's what I try to argue here, is because that makes them Thai Sinophone writers. That makes them writers if they are able to reflect on their literature, to discuss the literature, to maybe even criticize the literature, or to reflect on what's going on in the Sinophone community, the Sinophone Thai writers community. I think that's their main motivation to use metafiction. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tristan. And now I see two questions that are concerned with similar issues, particularly about the forthcoming or the new generations. And these two questions come from Zoe and Victor. So I guess in that case, I'll synthesize the questions on their behalf. And so for Zoe's part, she was asking, whether, well, because in your discussion, it seems like Sumagong and Zheng Xing very clearly, are building, but also deconstructing these notions of cultural identity and the role of heritage, right, from Chinese culture. So she was wondering whether this kind of what she calls the progressive consciousness in them have produced some kind of social trend within Thai societies. And I guess she was probably referring specifically to the Thai literary circles, perhaps, or the circles among Thai readership. And so what is the implication of this for the new generation nowadays? And I think this, to some extent, connects to Victor's question as well, because Victor was asking, and here I quote from Victor, considering your conceptualization of the new generation of Sinophone writing in Thailand as quote unquote regressive, would you go as far as to say that it represents some kind of loss in literary quality compared to the writings of Sumagong and Zheng Xing? And if so, what changes do you think could be undertaken to incentivize the changes that could keep this literature moving forward? So yeah, the two questions from them.
Thank you so much, Selena, for fusing them together. And also thank you both, Zoe, hi, and Victor, for your excellent questions. Let me start with the regressive and progressive part. And thank you, Zoe, for calling it progressive consciousness. I really like that. I hope I can use it. I will quote you. The regressive thing, yeah, I'm aware that is very negative. But what I didn't want to imply is a lesser quality. No, and that's also not so much, I think, what Feng Hing and Sumagong want to imply. they don't want to imply that it is of lesser quality what their new colleagues, the new generation, is producing. In fact, they are trying to include them as much as they can, and in a way guide them, advise them, mentor them, and in maybe thinking about their literature a little bit more. And they also they are, for example, also in the book, I mentioned the book, the volume before. They have also some of their stories and poems have been published also in these volumes. If they would think that they are of lesser quality, I doubt that they would actually publish them. So it's not so much a question of quality, but it is more a question of what they consider to be a representative kind of literature for the society of for the Sinophone writers, or for Sinophone literature in Thailand. And I think they are well, one could argue, of course, one could argue, well, that's just a development. Now they have, they write about their feelings and emotions, and not anymore about, they are not anymore reflecting on their work. They are not using metafiction anymore. Of course, you can argue that, and you can just argue, well, that's just the development every literature in every country makes. But I think the problem with that argument is, if we follow that argument and we say that these new generation and their works are in a way the future of Sinophone literature in Thailand, then the problem is that I think we miss a big part of a Sinophone literature in Thailand, that is the Thai part, and the part that reflects on the identity, of the authors, on the identity of what am I, not only as an author, but also as an individual, as a cultural being, if you want so. And that's what what Sumagong and Feng Hing do, but what the new generation of writers does not do, unfortunately. And if one sees that, I think it's easy to, for example, if you wouldn't know that these authors are in Thailand, actually, you wouldn't really see it in their works. You wouldn't realize it. Maybe sometimes they use the setting Thailand, but okay, I can be anywhere and use the setting as Thailand, right? I don't need to be in Thailand to write about Thailand, or to write a fictitious story about Thailand. Not at all. And that's the point. I think they have different experiences, but they also have a different view on the literature and what literature has to do, I think. And that's, I think, the biggest problem. And I called it regressive because, in a way, it's like the literature we have at the beginning, that is very Chinese, so to say, that has not yet, the writers who have not yet settled down in China, who are writing still about homesickness and about China mainly, and not about Thailand or the local flavor, or what it means to be in Thailand and to be Thai, and to discuss the meaning of being a writer in Thailand, a Sinophone writer in Thailand. So that's my answer to that question, to at least to parts of the question. Sorry, and I have to go back to Zoe. There was something else that you asked, right? Not only the progressive and regressive thing. Sorry, but I forgot. Maybe let me check if I find it again.
I think she was asking about the social trend, right? Yeah, the progressive consciousness and its impact.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Selina. Thank you. I think definitely that it does influence the society of Sinophone writers, or the community of Sinophone writers. It doesn't, if you were asking whether it influences the Thai society as a whole, I have to say no, of course, because the works are written in Chinese. They are usually not translated into Thai. So they are written for a specific Chinese-speaking community, for other fellow Sinophone writers, or for writers in Southeast Asia, or in mainland China, of course, as well. So they are not changing Thai society, if you want so, but they are definitely, I think, influencing the community of Sinophone writers by producing that literature, also to think about what they are producing and what they are doing.
I would like to follow up, on this conversation by just briefly, quoting from parts of the questions from Muchen and Sophia, because it seems like many of us in the audience are very curious about your thoughts or your prophecy on the future of Sinophone Thai literature. So because both of them are asking whether what do you expect or predict, for the future of Sinophone literature, either in Thailand or in Southeast Asia, broadly speaking. Although in this case, I would doubt that we can ever think about Southeast Asia as one package, right? And talk about the trend in a simplistic manner. But Muchen has this concern, which is also shared by Sophia, who asked about whether you see the future of Sinophone writing going, and what might be some of the features that might define, that you think it might define, or perhaps help define or help sort of guide the direction of future Sinophone writings and styles. If you want to quickly give us your comments or thoughts on this.
Thank you so much. Also excellent questions. And as Selina already said, I'm maybe not, or no one is maybe qualified, or maybe the Sinophone Thai writers themselves are more qualified to answer that question. I'm probably not qualified, but I can of course say my opinion. And or from what I've seen also, because I've traveled to Thailand, of course, a lot, and I have spent a lot of time at the conferences and also at the smaller gatherings where it often is discussed. What happens with us? What will happen if we are not there anymore? I mean, after all, they are quite old, and they don't know how long they will still be able to write. And that's one thing I mentioned briefly, I think, and when I answered a different question. What they are trying to do is to mentor the new generation. You especially see that with the Little Poetry Mill. I mentioned that they have like 10 core members, which are of course all from the older generation, so to say so. But they are trying to include more younger people now. They are actually trying to also to make them give them more responsibility by also letting them organize events, for example, and also trying to discuss their works, their poems in this case, more often with other poets from the older generation. And that's their way kind of guiding them into another direction, into reflecting more on their literature and thinking about what they are doing, and also thinking about the future of Thai Sinophone literature. So I think, to make a prediction, I think if that goes on, and if these writers of the newer generation are willing to adapt or to take on some of the criticism and to maybe reflect a little bit more, then they actually can change. It does not mean that they have to. Oh my God, that's not what anyone wants to imply. They don't have to do the same thing the older generation did. They don't have to copy in that sense their literature or what they wrote about in order to be more authentic, if you want. That's not what they mean. They just want to give them some guidance into a different direction and to make it in a way more representative for Sinophone literature from Thailand, but at the same time finding their own style, their own voice, and therefore developing a different kind of Sinophone literature in Thailand, which reflects Thailand and the situation in Thailand.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I think Tansen also has a question, so I'll let Tansen speak to you directly.
Selina, I see there are better questions from the students. Why don't you ask them first, and then I'll ask at the end.
Sure. Okay. You probably won't get some time to ask the question. We have many wonderful questions. In that case, let me actually perhaps ask Lily Huang to unmute. Perhaps Haoja could unmute Lily so that she can ask the questions, because I believe Lily has 2 questions which are quite specific, and I think it would be better if she asked the questions herself.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Rebecca Aaron, thank you so much for talking to us today. I had two questions. One is more just like factual based. The other one is a little bit based off of that. So I said that in the second peak of the Sinophone Thai literature during the 50s and 60s, did the influx of Chinese immigrants also have to write in secret despite the restriction of Chinese publication education? I believe it was mentioned that the restrictions were not lifted until the third peak in the 80s. So I was wondering how that worked out at that time.
Do you want me to answer this question first?
Would you like to ask the second question as well so that Rebecca can answer the two questions together?
Yeah, sure. And for the second one, I said that I noticed that in the examples of metafiction by Zheng Xin and Sumagong, there seems to be a pattern of direct confrontation between the author and the plagiarist or thief, and whether you think that these motifs of theft and intellectual property stealing serve any types of critiques for the greater Thai society that they lived in, or are they just mainly vehicles of self-critique?
Thank you so much for both of your questions. The first one is quickly answered, so maybe I didn't make it clear enough. I'm sorry about that in the presentation. There were two periods of restriction separately from another that has to do with the political situation in Thailand, and it actually was in the hands of the same person who was in power at that time, Phipun. So he was the one who implemented the restrictions both times. So after the first peak and then once again after the second peak. And those restrictions after the second peak, after the second low, they were only lifted then in the 1980s, and that led to the third peak, so to say. So we have two separate restrictions, and they were lifted the first time. Then we have the second peak, and then we have the second low with the restrictions, and then those restrictions are lifted, and we have the third peak. So that's hopefully that answers your question about the restrictions. And the second one, I don't think that it critiques the greater Thai society so much as it might critique the overall practice that one might see by some fellow writers in the society and in the community of Sinophone writers. So they never said or mentioned anything to me or said that it's a huge problem, that they have a lot of writers who copy something or who plagiarize, that they have to kind of be careful about that. And from one example, at least, you could also see that it refers back to the 1990s. So it was that someone copied something from the 1990s, and the story I was mentioning here is also written during the late 1990s. So that has probably also changed a little bit now. It might have been a problem earlier, although they never explicitly told me or said that it has ever been a huge problem. But indeed, I was asking the same question. I was thinking about, is it really something they need to address that often and that much, because it actually happens so often? And I think that goes just to a general, idea, or the general things that the general presence, to say so, that it sometimes happens, or it actually probably often happens, that someone else copies your work. And for them, it is even worse in a sense, because that undermines their position, which is already very fragile, because it's not an established literature. Sinophone literature in Thailand is not something that has a huge audience or that everyone is eager to read. And if then one finds out that some of the authors even are just plagiarizing others, are just plagiarizing maybe Chinese authors, as it was suggested in the one story, then this is, of course, very bad for the whole reputation of Sinophone literature in Thailand. So that's, I think, why they also mention it or write about it that often. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I see that we're coming to the end of the event, but since we have a lot of questions here, I wonder, Rebecca, if you would be willing to take 2 more questions and by 2 more. I mean, for the first one, I will summarize a couple of them as a set. Which I think are quite related, and again could touch on our ongoing conversation about literature and society. And the second one is more specific, and perhaps we can end on that note. So the first batch of the question, and here I synthesized from Lily Yao and Chen Wei Chen from who is a member of the graduate program of transcultural studies at Heidelberg University. So a colleague from Europe, and Mia, as well as Winnie. So in their questions, they're interested in hearing about the targeted readership and markets of these Sinophone Thai writings. What is the targeted readers and market, and what from your perspective and in your research, what are the current scholarly response to these writings from mainland China, from mainland Chinese perspective?
Yes.
And to follow up on that, and here I quote from Mia, who asked that since many authors have brought up criticisms or issues surrounding mainland Chinese influence on Southeast Asian communities. So from this perspective, then how have the writers that you discussed addressed or not these issues, and is there a concern for this in the forthcoming generation as well? And from Lily Yao, again, okay, here's a question about literature's social engagement. How do you think this particular event of the Nanjing Massacre and Sino-Japanese relations may have affected or influenced the society of Sinophone Thai writers as a whole?
Thank you very much for all of these questions. So I'm going to start with the target readers or the markets. When I first started my research many years ago in 2010, my initial thought was that they are, of course, writing for China, because they want to give a Chinese readership, want to show them how their life is in Thailand, and so on and so on. But that has changed. That assumption that I had at the very beginning, when I didn't know a lot about the literature, I don't think that is true. Of course, they want to be recognized. That's of course something they still want. They still are looking for recognition. Also in the mainland, that's why they also publish these volumes. They are published in China, and they hope for people to read them and to also criticize them, or in any way contact them, get in dialogue, start a dialogue with them, and so on. But I think they are mainly writing nowadays for the society of or for the community of Sinophone writers, so for their peers, which is quite big. I didn't mention that. I think we have like about 100 active writers at the moment, and which is for such a small niche literature, in my opinion, a lot of writers actually, and they are writing for them, but they are also writing for other Sinophone writers in Southeast Asia. They have a lot of meeting and conferences every year, at least one, where they meet in a different country and where they present their works, discuss literary trends, and so on. So there is a very vibrant community actually of Sinophone writers in Southeast Asia, and they exchange their works. They frequently discuss their works together, and try to get feedback. And of course, they also wish that Chinese-speaking individuals in these countries in Thailand I have, if so, it's very implicit. Can you still hear me? Because it says my internet is unstable.
Yeah, it broke out
okay.
a little bit. But
okay, good. Okay, great, thank you. They are not critical. They don't write about China or political circumstances or what is going on in China or comment on that. And when I asked them why they are, I didn't ask them why are you not critical of China, of course, but I asked them how they see their relationship with the politics in general, but also with the Chinese government. They said that it's literature. They are not interested in the politics, and that's why that's a very I guess a very how should I put it? A very good answer if you want to circumvent and not give a direct answer, but. Yeah, that's what they said. I mean, they are not interested in the politics. They don't write literature about politics, and they are not including that in their literature. I have to say that they are indeed discussing a little bit or criticizing a little bit more explicitly, I have to say the Thai government, though. So that's interesting to see. It's not very often, but there are poems, for example, by Feng Hing, where he mentions what's going on the streets, where it's about demonstrations and what people are doing. Very vivid, actually. He uses he's not saying that there's blood on the street, but then of course in poems you do it metaphorically, and so that's what he's doing sometimes. So he in that way he is more explicitly criticizing the Thai society, Thai political situation more frequently than the Chinese politics or the Chinese society. And the third question was about the Nanjing massacre. Yeah, I was wondering about that at the beginning of my research as well, because it was one of the some of the first examples I read were about the Nanjing massacre, and I was very interested because they didn't live during the Nanjing massacre, and I was at least didn't experience it themselves, because they weren't even in China at that time, or not even been born. So they didn't experience it themselves, but of course they saw the impact. And also I think that goes for the idea of who they are writing for. And as I mentioned, although maybe China is not their primary target, at least that's what they say, they want to connect, and doing that by discussing the Nanjing massacre, which is still something that has deeply influenced the Chinese society up until today. I think that's a very good way to connect to a readership especially of their own generation, or of a later generation, because it kind of shows that they empathize with them and what happened to them as a whole, as a country. But I also have to say that there is one story, for example, by Sumagong, where it starts off as like anti-Japanese, because we have a Japanese woman. She's married to a Thai of Chinese descent, and at the beginning, the father of that man doesn't like her at all because she's Japanese. So he has this very old and conservative view. But at the end of the story, he realizes that the Japanese are not all the same, and that that his daughter-in-law actually is not representing the whole of Japan, and that one shouldn't judge just because she's Japanese, which has like a moral value, and maybe again wants to teach the readers something, to have a second look and not to be judgmental about these things, for example.
Just quickly, on behalf of Chen Wei Chen, who asked if these writers are not criticizing the Thai government in Thai, but in Chinese?
Yeah, so at least in the poems that I read, but I have to say that I am not that fluent in Thai. I'm not able to read, I wouldn't be able to read it. I just know that they rarely publish in Thai, and that there are one or two. I think Feng Hing has like 2 translated works, 2 of his poetry collections. They actually also were printed or translated into Thai. And I have to check again. I can't answer that question. It might be that this particular poem that I mentioned, or these poems criticizing the Thai government, is also in that poetry collection. I don't know. I have to check, but it's a very, very good question, and I indeed have to look it up, whether that is included here. But then it would be only a translation. It wouldn't be an original text. So he initially wrote it definitely for a Chinese audience.
Thank you, Rebecca. So perhaps we could wrap up our conversation on this last question, okay, which I think would also be very helpful, for those of us in the audience who study literature, specifically, especially those of us who are not familiar, okay, with the notion of flash fiction. So this question comes from Fiona, okay, who would like to hear perhaps a working definition, a guiding definition on what constitutes a flash fiction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Fiona. That's another excellent question. Also, because that is a very important question, actually. I should have explained it, what flash fiction is. Flash fiction is just a very, very short. It's usually between 180 and 220 characters. That's at least what Sumagong suggests, what is real flash fiction. So Chinese characters, which is like barely a page. And when you translate it, it might into English or German, it's usually one page, not more. And this is a trend which we have. I think it started in China at the beginning of the 2008 or something, 7-8, and again it's coming from China. So they as he said also in the quote, he was inspired by what's going on in China and he wants to try it out now. And the thing is, I didn't include that quote, but I really like it. He's also explaining in his Sumagong, in his short story collection, his first flash fiction collection, that he slowly evolved his short fiction. First, he was writing short stories, which are longer, and then they became shorter and shorter. And that's also because not only because he wanted to try out something new or something that he's seen, but also because he thinks that the shorter, in a way, the better, because the more people will read it because it's short. And it's also, he also talks about the tension, because on the one hand it's short, but there is so much in it. Usually, like with poems, they are short. You have read it in like a moment, and the short flash fiction the same. You don't need a lot of time, but there is so much in it. And also for the writer, you have to put so much work into it to write that very short piece, because it needs to have depth. Of course, it shouldn't be like just flat and boring. It needs to have some creativity added to it. So it's kind of difficult, although often considered very easy because it is so short. So yeah, that's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think, in fact, this working definition of how intricate and how multifaceted the genre of flash fiction, in fact, to some extent, it suggests the intricacy, right, between China, and Thailand, right, and all these layered, conversations that we could have, right, about that relationship between two societies, between multiple communities, that cannot be simplified, right, in within just one or two short, sentences, right? So I think that's probably the fun of, playing with this interesting, but also highly connotative genre.
Can I just add something, just
sure.
Really quickly?
Sure.
Since we had so many questions that I wasn't able to answer now, thank you, by the way, for staying over time, for staying longer. I will definitely, I assume I get all the questions. I think Haucher told me that I can have all the questions, and I will reach out to you and try to answer your questions. If you, I will try to find out who you are and try to reach out to you and answer your question, because I think all your questions were really, really nice and really brilliant, really excellent, and I'm really happy. Thank you for all your comments, ideas, and questions, and I don't want to leave them unanswered. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. So in fact, let me just quickly acknowledge that among the questions that we are not able, to answer, okay, we have questions from Shine, Chris, Lily Wong, and Zoe again got another question, and Victor, okay, who said that he is a Thai literature student. So I think the question
Nice.
will be interesting. I will definitely report that question to you, Joelle. And so, thank you all, okay, for contributing questions. Okay, we'll be putting together a report of all these wonderful questions for Rebecca in case she wants to reach out to you individually. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for this wonderful and rich conversation. So I hope that sometime soon, okay, we will be able to reunite in person finally somewhere. If not, in Shanghai, perhaps elsewhere, where we can have another conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you, Selena, again, for managing also the questions so brilliantly. That really helped. And thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, okay, for participating.